This week on The Wheelhouse. Higher education faces a test. Declining enrollment, school closures, and the question, do you even need a degree? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Officials from schools of higher ed all across America say they need help to stay open. In the final days of the 2025 legislative session in Connecticut, you'll be hearing about how local colleges and universities don't think they're getting a fair shake in the new two-year budget. With steep enrollment declines, shifting thoughts about the value of a college education, colleges and universities are struggling to stay open. What does this tumult in higher education mean for the economy? Can we still attract the best and brightest international students? Do we have the skilled labor needed to fill jobs? This hour, the future of higher ed. And we'd like to hear from you today. If you're attending or working at a local college or university, hit us up. You got to join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. To tell us how things are going for colleges and universities in Connecticut, I'm joined by a former communications major at Emerson College, Susan Raff, WFSB News Channel 3's chief political reporter. Good morning, Susan. You like that? Robin Doyen-Aiken wrote that into the script, my boss.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's nice to see both of you.
Good morning. Nice to see you. And Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, investigative reporter for Hearst Connecticut Media. You know what Jackie did? She broke the news last October that the leader of Connecticut's largest public college system had been spending state money in ways that he shouldn't have. Can't wait to tap into her reporting on that. Jackie, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Susan, you get the first question. Colleges and universities are lamenting, I think that's a strong word, lamenting Lamont. Governor Ned Lamont's budget proposal, the higher education portion of the governor's budget, calls for cuts to the University of Connecticut and Connecticut State colleges and universities. How big of a cut are we talking
Let's
here?
back up a little bit. Keep in mind, UConn usually gets whatever it wants, right? UConn gets quite a bit of money, and they have the ability to get a lot of out-of-state students, which, Central and the community colleges do not. This is a tough year, too, because of the fact that Connecticut has a surplus, and so a lot of education agencies are all looking for money. But there are bigger picture issues, and that is, what could be coming from the federal government. This is a tough time to be in education, I think, and we do want to attract the best and the brightest. And as Jacqueline will tell you, it doesn't help when your chancellor gets busted for, being too loose with taxpayer dollar and enjoying himself too much. So that has that. But there's another angle to this, and that is that apparently they didn't spend all their ARPA money, right? So that's out there too. So I'm not sure they're going to get what they want.
The cuts, I think, are going to happen in year two. This is a budget that spans 2 years, obviously. It's a biennium budget. Will they continue during the second year? Do you know what the time frame is in terms of the cuts and how it actually looks like?
I don't, but, that's common with a 2-year budget, right? So some things are funded in year one, not in year two. Like special education, I understand, is like that. The governor's budget calls for some funding in the first year, or the second year, not in the first year. So I'm not sure exactly. And everything now is very fluid. I mean, keep in mind, we only have a few more weeks to go, less than a month. And things like higher ed, education, special education, those are all things that are being negotiated. There are many different plans out there. Something will happen. What it is, we're just not sure.
Ooh, okay. Let's go back into the ARPA money, though, because I think we can go there. NBC Connecticut reporter Mike Savino recently pointed out that UConn and CSCU used up their combined $270 million in one-time American Rescue Plan Act funding, that they need more money from the state to make up for the loss in federal funding. So has the governor addressed that ask? What are other lawmakers saying? I want to know, because it seems like, they might. Some are saying they didn't spend the ARPA money. Some are saying they did. Just kind of help us understand that.
It's interesting with ARPA money, because if you take like public health, for example, they had some ARPA dollars that they didn't spend, right? And so apparently it's fair game. If you don't spend that money, the feds can take it back. So the bottom line is with ARPA money, if you get it, you need to spend it. I'm not exactly sure how much ARPA money the higher ed has and what they haven't spent, but I am told that they do have it.
Right, that's right. So ARPA would the feds would take back the ARPA money that's unspent. That's right.
Right.
I think the thing about this is money is very fungible in higher ed. So whether it's ARPA money, whether it's reserve money, there is a large reserve in these schools. I think the difference that the conversation that they're having now at the Capitol is, are we able to tap that? Reserves are considered either restricted or unrestricted, and whether that's ARPA money and people were sort of saving that away to provide a sort of a softer exit ramp when this federal ARPA money went away, I think is part of the conversation. And whether or not the money has already been committed, that is in the reserve fund, and whether it's restricted for things like capital projects that they've committed to, they have bond premium payments on that they have to make and they don't have a choice about.
Right, because Jacqueline will tell you, and the last thing a university, or I think all of us want, is to raise tuition. But UConn is always in a better situation because they have an enormous attractability with their athletics, and people come from out of state. I'm not sure Central or the community colleges, where people are really struggling to get by to increase their education, can afford to pay more.
So UConn has a huge, when state money is down, they can increase out-of-state enrollment to cover that gap. And so that sort of calls into the question of how much of a state university is it when you're enrolling more out-of-state students. There's an argument to be made that some of those students are retained and stay in state after their graduation. But as it becomes harder and harder for people to go to UConn and get accepted to UConn, that's a tension point as well.
You said that nobody wants to raise tuition. Well, as we're going to find out later in the show from John Marcus of the Hechinger Report and Brian Rosenberg from Harvard University, everybody's going to have to raise tuition at some point if they can, if people can afford college and continue to go. But stay tuned for that. It's going to be a very important conversation. 888-720-9677. We'd hoping that you're sharing your personal anecdotes with this experience. So what we're hearing nationally a lot is that people might have to tap into an endowment or something like that. Is this what we're talking about on the local system? These are public colleges and universities, so there's not necessarily like an endowment. We're talking about maybe like some kind of state reserve system.
So there are reserves. The amounts are reported every year, again, about the restricted and unrestricted, how much is truly able to be tapped into that. Separate from that, UConn does have an endowment, but it's not good fiscal practice to start tapping into that to cover your operating expenses. And there's their endowment. Last time I looked at their endowment levels, they're not huge. So, you're not talking about like Trinity College or Yale's endowment levels.
Or Wesleyan or any kind of private school like that. Yeah, the state universities don't traditionally have big endowments.
Yeah, it shows you how much I know about endowments and higher education by the way that I framed that question. Hey, Jackie, there's this financial crisis, and then there's crisis management, and Susan alluded to this earlier. CSCU's current chancellor is Terrence Chang, but he's technically on the outs. Hearst, Connecticut's Jackie Rabe Thomas right next to me reporting that through a separation agreement, Terrence Chang, stepping down as the head of Connecticut's largest public university college system, Chang reportedly acknowledged state reports of troubling expenses funded by taxpayer and student tuition dollars, a story Jackie broke earlier this year. Do we know how much the CSCU does to support schools going through the type of struggles we're talking about today? We're talking about closures and things like that, mergers, and what role Chang would have in that normally if things were going well?
So central office at the CSU system is sort of the more sort of big picture policy goals and implementation, and helps guide the Board of Regents to determine tuition increases and set budgets that go to every single of the schools in the system. That system is able to shut down campuses and reconsider them. That, I would argue, is the reason why one of Chang's predecessors, Gregory Gray, when he tried to start shutting down campuses in Meriden and was considering other places, I think Torrington was another satellite campus that was under consideration. That was really...
it's gone.
Yeah, that was really his downfall, because now you're talking about legislators' districts, and that really rankled a lot of people. And I'm not sure for how much of a savings that would have actually achieved.
Shout out to Tucson. I went there for a couple of years, but it is no longer.
Well, there's such struggling. If you remember Marco Jakian, I go back to those days when they wanted that whole consolidation plan with the community colleges, simply for the fact that enrollment is down, but they didn't want to lose their own identity. So they tried to come up with one central name and system, but not close any of the community college campuses, which is important because people who live in those communities want to be able to access them.
And that's what we're kind of talking about on today's show. We're talking about closures happening nationwide. We'll get into it a little more in the second segment about demographic cliffs and less people actually being around to go to college. There's less 18-year-olds. We'll talk about that a little later. But that's essentially what Connecticut has done to kind of avoid college closures. We have seen some, though. We're talking about Pyre College in Bridgeport being one that is shut down, and also Stone Academy. There's a little bit of controversy around Stone Academy, but the point is they had no money. So there's those, and there's also rumors, and we can dig into that a little later. But Chang's been credited by the governor for the work done to consolidate the state's community college system, is basically what we're getting at. He also says college applications and graduations are up under Chang. Chang's contract isn't being terminated, so help us here. He'll get paid the money owed to him until his contract ends. And how are lawmakers taking that?
Yeah, so the settlement agreement is exercising a clause in his contract where it's a termination clause. 4.1 is the termination clause. So they are terminating him.
They are? Okay.
They are. They are living out his contract, which is required under his contract to get a 12-month notice period. And so they're paying him $443,000 over the next year to play an advising role. There's a lot of question around how much advising will take place around someone who I think many legislators have expressed no confidence in him, as well as some of the leadership of the Board of Regents have expressed no confidence in him. So there's debate around how active of a role that will in fact be. Your question about the getting credit for consolidating the schools, man, that has been a slow train since I covered higher ed, 7 or 8 years ago. Of in the works. That was first proposed by Governor Malloy during his first year in office, and it finally got across the finish line of getting accreditation. I think it was last year, and it's still causing ripple effects for just some administrative changes that have huge implications of whether places will have a dean on their college campus, and really having people who know the institution firsthand.
Maybe some of this is saying nice things about Chang in public, but kind of burying the knife behind the scenes.
Well, kudos to Jackie, really, because breaking the story.
I'd love to hear that.
But before we move on from the dirty laundry, I really think what here is that this is a huge black eye for the governor and his administration. And I had heard that Chang would have filed a lawsuit if they had terminated him and let him go immediately. And so rather than go through that and drag that out, give him, it's close to $500,000, right, for the remainder of his term. But it's very interesting and ironic that he's going to be consulting to the very board that wanted to fire him.
Yeah, I think this is a
strange bedfellows. So
yeah, I think this is a really good opportunity for the legislature to sort of consider their role in ensuring something like this doesn't happen again. A lot of the things that I found were either in his contract that permitted him to get things like a housing allowance when 90% of other college presidents across this country don't get that benefit in PhD to granting institutions, or a car benefit, which, very few college presidents get those. So some of these things were contractual, but other things were just sort of questionable spending, like going out regularly with the governor's chief of staff or his higher ed commissioner, meeting with other state employees to get $60, $70 steaks and get chauffeured rides, and sort of questionable spending.
Too far, I think. And I think what Jackie points out, there's nothing that
the governor said that's pricey.
Yeah, there's no clear violation. So it wasn't like, oh, we got you. I mean, the optics are very bad, especially in a university system. You're a state employee. You can't really go out and lavishly take long car rides throughout Litchfield County and spend all this money. It looks bad. So I think they were in a tough situation. They wanted to figure out how to get rid of him as quickly and as painlessly as possible, but it still stings a little bit.
And we're talking about taxpayer dollars
Of
and
course.
tuition dollars as well.
Buy your own steak.
By your own sake. I'm glad that Jackie brought up the separation agreement because it did sound kind of like a soft landing because you had the advisory role and then there's the teaching gig at Western Connecticut State University on his way out the door of the CSCU system. WestCon, financial struggles and accreditation challenges of its own, according to Connecticut Insider, where Jackie works. It was Alex Putterman who told me on a previous episode of The Wheelhouse that Terrence Chang was once asked if WestCon would close as a result. He said no. But for a school like WestCon, Susan, this is what we'll finish up higher ed with. For other schools in the system, UConn even, what comes next? What do they do without the federal and state budget increases? Maybe UConn's better off, you guys are saying, but what about the other schools?
I don't know. Again, I think UConn survives no matter what. I mean, they're a very good academic school and the tuition isn't all that much, and they do get a huge amount of interest from out of state, whether they change that ratio. I think it's harder for Central, for WestCon, for Eastern, those state schools, because of the fact that they are seeing a limited enrollment. I think more people are going to the community colleges than that. I mean, that you see a lot of people there because they want to better their education. You have a lot of English learners.
And it could be free education, too.
It is very free if you go there for 2 years, and then you can transition yourself to Central. So I think that those schools have a tougher situation. They don't have to create as much housing, though, as like a UConn does, which they need a lot more housing. So what they get from the legislature will be, we'll have to wait and see.
You work at the Capitol. A lot of the conversation, particularly since Donald Trump was reelected, and he appointed Linda McMahon as U.S. Education Secretary, surrounding K through 12 as a result. How are lawmakers responding to potential cuts to public educations in the final days of the 2025 legislative session? Susan, essentially, this is your broad view, broad brush at K through 12.
So I learned yesterday that for the first time in 8 years, lawmakers are fully funding the ECS formula. That is the agreed upon formula that the state helps municipalities or local school districts. So that's good. But it still falls short of what's needed for things like special education, which is enormously expensive with transportation. As for the bigger picture, Connecticut is losing federal funding for education. And I think that's one of the reasons why lawmakers are very hesitant to spend any of the reserves or the surplus because they just don't know. Republicans say it's not as bad as it looks. Democrats are sounding the alarm. But we have lost funding for public health and education. And as we go down that path, we don't know how much money Connecticut is going to need. So you can be sure there will be a special session probably at the end of the summer to kind of figure that out.
And then really quickly, because we're running out of time, let's talk about today we're having a morning without childcare. So it's a special day for folks for advocates in the community for pre-K.
Right, big push by the governor, and rightfully so, because the payoff is huge. If you get people, mainly women, who want to go back to work or, start a career, and they have no child care. I mean, private child care is very, very expensive. Plus, those places are closing down. The Bright Horizons, the Kinder Care, you don't see them as much anymore. I don't know if it's mainly because people can't.
Childcare deserts.
They can't, right, you can't afford that. So Beth Bai in the Office of Early Childhood, and kudos to her, there are plans on the table to make it free with some income guidelines. There are some for everyone. But they want to provide maybe like about 20,000 children in our state and their parents the ability to have childcare.
You're hearing good things that the endowment could happen. You're talking about the endowment. They're talking about over 10 years funding it and trying to make it happen.
Correct. They want to have like a trust fund where it would earn money on its own and put money in there so that it would continue for long term, so they wouldn't have to keep funding it every 2 years.
That should go through the budget?
I think so, what the plan is, but I think everyone is on board with that. The question is which plan. But the more we do with early childhood, the better we are also for the economy.
you had a comment. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, on the K through 12 fully funding education, I was fortunate that I got to cover the school funding trial that happened when I was an education reporter years ago. And, the mantra that they're fully funding education, I would just be remiss to not mention that the foundation of what they're funding is just pulled out of a hat based on what they can fund. It's not based on any sort of measurement of how much does it actually cost to educate each child. It's based on what the budget can afford. And so school districts saying your $5,280 foundation that hasn't changed in years, I think is a good comment, or is a good point to have made, that you're not basing it on the actual cost of education.
And education's so vocal now. You see the on the air, right? Advertising. I mean, educators, I've interviewed them a bunch of times. They are at the Capitol. They want to be heard because they need new schools. They need money for special education. They can't retain their teachers. They can't recruit new teachers. They need the money.
You've been listening to Susan Raff, WFSB News Channel 3's chief political reporter. Susan, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, good morning and thank you.
Oh, so good to have you on the show this morning. And of course, my other good friend, Jackie Rabe Thomas, investigative reporter for Hearst Connecticut Media Group. Jackie, great to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh my God, thank you for coming on. After the break, a look at what experts are calling a demographic cliff in higher education and what that might mean for our economy. Do you think college is still worth it? Give us your thoughts. Call 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Higher education is in trouble. Between rising tuition costs, declining enrollment, and political turmoil on campus, its future is unclear. How the heck did we get here? What are these institutions doing to survive? Joining me now, John Marcus, senior higher ed reporter for the Hechinger Report and co-host of the podcast College Uncovered. John, so great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So good to have you back on the Wheelhouse. Good to see you there. And also with us, Brian Rosenberg. Brian is a visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse.
My pleasure.
Excited to talk to you both. Folks can join the conversation if they'd like. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. A lot of nuance to dig into here. John, I got to start with you. Last time you were on the show, you dropped a bomb on me about smaller private colleges, how they'd fare in this crisis. But I want to focus on some of these smaller sort of public colleges that we talked about in the last segment. I'm thinking about WestCon. I'm thinking about Eastern Connecticut University. I'm thinking about Central Connecticut State. That's where our reporters, Susan Raff and Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, were seeming to at least sound the alarm around those schools. I shouldn't doubt you. I would imagine you know a lot about these schools somehow because you do know so much about the landscape. Would that raise any alarm with you as well for schools like that?
Well, what they're facing at the foundation is they're just running out of students. There are, as you mentioned that term, the demographic cliff that's been coined to talk about the decline in the number of 18-year-olds. And that began with the Great Recession. People stopped having children during economic downturns and the Great Recession in 2008. That happened. 18 years later, the high school graduates about to graduate over the next few weeks, including in Connecticut, that's the peak number of 18-year-olds. That begins to decline in Connecticut. It goes to down 10% by 2034. So there's just fewer students going to these universities. It's much harder to close a public university than it is to close a private college because there are so many more constituents and there's so much more accountability to legislators and taxpayers. But it's happening. It's happening in states like Vermont, Pennsylvania. Georgia has merged 14 public university campuses. So it's certainly within the realm of possibility.
College enrollment was 14.8% below peak enrollment in 2022 versus 2010, Brian. That's according to the National Center for Education Statistics. Fewer and fewer people choosing to go to college these days. Why?
Well, obviously demographics is part of it, but beyond demographics, as you say, fewer people are choosing to go. I think Two main reasons. One is cost. It's expensive and it's complicated to figure out how much it costs. The other reason is the perceived value of the degree. I think a lot of students, particularly male students, are making the calculation that both the financial cost and the opportunity cost aren't worth it, and are choosing either to go directly into the labor force or to take shorter term educational programs that cost them less and that get them into jobs more quickly. So, rightly or wrongly, there is definitely a perception that the value of a traditional bachelor's degree has declined, and so fewer students are choosing to go.
We're talking so much about this demographic cliff, and we're going to dig into it a little further, but also asking whether or not college is worth it. That's not us openly questioning that college is worth it, folks that are listening to this show. We're just trying to make sure that we're talking about one of the issues facing colleges and universities right now. Last year, we talked about the crisis facing I'm thinking about college and university endowments, John. Can schools dip into their endowments? And if not now, then when? And could endowments or at least state reserves help schools in Connecticut concerned about state and federal funding?
Yeah, if not now, then when is a really good question.
Sure.
What universities will tell you is that endowments are often restricted by the donors to fill only a particular role. In a financial emergency, and some small private institutions have done this, you can literally go to court and ask a judge for permission to use endowment funding for purposes other than what was specified by the donor. But universities have been reluctant to do that. They also tend to be hesitant to dip into their enrollments. Universities use less of their endowments, sorry, endowments, not enrollments. Universities use less of their endowments, less of a proportion of their endowments than other charitable institutions. And there's actually an exception in the law for them. Other philanthropies have to use at least 5% of the proceeds from their endowment. Universities don't. And so surprisingly, during periods of stress, preceding this one, during COVID, during the Great Recession, universities tended not to dip into these endowments that you would have assumed they were saving for a rainy day. Some critics and economists that study this suggest it's because the size of an endowment is a measure of the prestige of your institution, and universities don't want to reduce the size of their endowments unless they absolutely have no other choice.
Are there really arid sort of demographic deserts? So another way, I guess, to say that would be, are there areas in the United States that are experiencing worse demographic declines than others?
Yeah, we live in one. The Northeast and the Midwest. 38 states will see declines in the number of 18-year-olds. 12 won't. So those tend to be in the Sun Belt, in the Southwest. And so the challenge for universities and colleges in states like Connecticut and New York is going to see a 27% decline in the number of 18-year-olds. I live in Boston. That's a problem in Boston because a lot of the students that come here to universities and colleges come from New York. They're going to have to start to recruit from places that they haven't traditionally and groups that they haven't traditionally, notably Hispanic students who are the only group within 18-year-olds that's increasing. Every other group is declining. Universities haven't been great at enrolling Hispanic students. Now it's a matter of survival for them.
I want to talk about that particular demographic and that particularly that ethnicity as well in a second. In your estimation, Brian, is the financial trajectory of higher education in the United States, I think the word we want to use here is sustainable, so for schools and for students?
With the exception of a very small group of very wealthy schools, I actually don't think it's sustainable. When we talk about endowments, for instance, the reality is that the vast majority of colleges and universities in the United States have very, very small endowments. We tend to think about places like Harvard with $53 billion, or Princeton, or private colleges like Wesleyan. But the reality is that the vast majority don't have endowments to dip into. And I also think that with the exception of those wealthy institutions, it's going to be very, very hard to sustain the financial trajectory of these institutions. The discount rate at private institutions in the United States right now is getting close to 60%. If you walked into a store and you saw a sign that said 60% off everything, you would assume it was a closeout sale. And that number goes up every year. And sooner or later, you're going to get to 100% and you're going to have to give it away for free, which is obviously not sustainable.
I'm sorry to
So I
laugh.
think there need,
Go
yeah,
ahead, sir.
I think there needs to be a serious rethink of the entire financial model.
I'm sorry to laugh at that but it's a great alliteration to just to think about the picture of the 60% off sale. And it goes back to what John told me about a year ago, which is that there is sticker shock, but nobody's paying the sticker price anymore. And I would imagine that I should say that a lot of people aren't paying the sticker price anymore. And a lot of schools, I would imagine, would like to raise the cost of tuition to try to get through this, but that's not necessarily something that can happen, John?
They've actually lowered the price of tuition when adjusted for inflation. And you're right, at 448 universities, not a single student, not one student pays the sticker price. That is the list price that the college advertises that it costs. They pay
438 schools nationwide, you're saying?
148 schools nationwide. Not one student pays the list price. It's a strange sort of strategy that universities and colleges have trouble getting themselves out of advertising a high price and then offering scholarships as an inducement to recruit students. It's become, as Brian says, the discount rate, the proportion of tuition that goes back out the door in the form of discounts and financial aid is now more than half of revenue. That is absolutely unsustainable. One issue, though, that your listeners might be aware of if they have kids in college or if they go to college themselves, is that doesn't mean it's cheaper to go to college, because what colleges and universities are doing, your previous guests were talking about housing at the University of Connecticut,
Yes.
for instance. It's housing and dining, which I think a lot of people think there's a perception that universities break even on those things. They do not. They make a lot of money on those things, and they're shifting a lot of the revenue generation to those. So the real increase in the cost of college now is dorms and dining, and not tuition.
The enrollment, this decline in enrollment, we want to try to figure out what it means for jobs and the economy, especially in areas where colleges and universities are closing. Can you help me with that, John?
Yeah, sure. I always say that it's a really important point. Not everybody needs to go to college. I think that we, for a while, were sending that message that everybody had to go to college, and a lot of people went, didn't know why they were there, never finished, ended up with debt, never attained a credential. But somebody needs to go to college. We live in a global knowledge economy where we're competing against economic rivals who have increased the college-going levels of their young people, while in America it's declined. As Brian pointed out, the proportion of high school graduates going directly to college is way down from 70%. That was the peak in 2016 to about 62% now. That's a big proportion of Americans who are voting with their feet that they don't think college is worth it. For some people it might not be, in some programs it might not be, in some majors it might not be. But if some people don't go to college, we're in trouble. We are also experiencing another demographic shift, which is the retirement of the baby boomers. All of those people who are very well-educated people who are in the economy, someone needs to fill those jobs. And we are not producing enough college graduates to do it.
Got a caller. Joining us now from Woodbury, Connecticut is going to be Doug. You're on with John Marcus, Brian Rosenberg, and myself, Frankie Graziano. Go ahead, Doug.
Hi, thank you. I generally agree with a lot that's been said so far, that the cost and benefit is strongly being questioned, and I think that's probably true. That's good. But there's other aspects, and there seems to be a lot of focus on effectively blaming the university systems and the funding of those university systems. And I think that's off-center. That's misguided. I think that society in general needs to have an understanding that defending democracy really demands well-educated people, all kinds of education, liberal arts, engineering, law, medicine. We need that kind of culture. And I think that the value that a college education or a strong education can bring to the populace is being not represented very well. And
Sure.
I think our culture needs
Doug,
to
you're
shift
saying that
a lot
you're saying
way.
that college systems are getting blamed. Who should
Yes.
shoulder the blame there? Should it be society? Should it be regular people and how they value education?
I think the corporations can change their focus. They really just want people to do certain jobs to make them money and profit. And I think the corporations need to improve their culture. They're being presented as just money mongers to have people work for them, and they can change that to be really good, technical, innovative people and a culture that cares about their society around them. I think the companies, the corporations, the stock market needs to change, and I think the culture of the country needs to be improved to defend democracy, and education is part of that.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate that. And we're going to talk later on in this episode about exactly what you were addressing there and what can be done to kind of fix enrollment. And before we go there, and before I have Brian respond to that call, I just want to kind of talk about why somebody would need a college degree in 2025. Let's get there now, Brian. Let's talk about, despite all of these challenges, why people should actually go to college.
Well, I'll address that. I do want to address that question because I thought it was a wonderful comment.
Sure.
Obviously, despite all of the criticisms of the value of college, the data still suggests that an investment in a college degree has the highest ROI pretty much of any investment you can make. That is, for most people who get a 4-year bachelor's degree, by the time they're out of their 30s, whatever they spent on it will have paid itself back and more. So financially, for most people, and of course there are always exceptions, it's still the right decision. But the point that your caller made is a really important one. And that is that in order to have a functional democracy, you need an educated citizenry. When Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, when Benjamin Franklin founded what became the University of Pennsylvania, they were very clear about the fact that they wanted these schools to provide vocational training, but they also wanted them to educate the kind of citizens who make democracy possible. And so there's a real danger if we lose sight of the role of education in a democracy, that our democracy will degrade. And unfortunately, I do believe we're seeing some of that right now. And so I would never diminish the importance of college as vocational training, but it's not the only point of college. And we need to remind ourselves of that as well.
If you go back, go ahead, John. Yeah, pick it up.
So another part of what the caller said, I think, is also important, and 100% agree. You know, it's important in a democracy that we have an educated citizenry. But to put the blame on colleges, there is a degree to which a question arises, and Brian wrote an entire book about this. Are colleges really paying enough attention to doing what they do more efficiently, more effectively, more productively? Completion rates have not improved. That is the proportion of students who actually graduate. To pick up on Brian's analogy, if you were a private business and fewer than half of your customers got what they paid for, in the case of higher education, that's the proportion of students who finish a 4-year degree in 4 years, you would be out of business. So there are underneath all of the chaos and turmoil that's politically, driven right now, there are legitimate questions to be raised about whether what we're getting for our money is efficient and effective.
Let's talk about that book that Brian wrote. Brian Rosenberg, of course, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But let's talk about it after the break. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Still with me, Brian Rosenberg, visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and John Marcus, senior higher ed reporter for the Hechinger Report and co-host of the podcast College Uncovered. Are you worried about college and university closures? Is a college education as relevant and necessary as it was 25 years ago? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Let's dig into why it's important and what can be done to get people to college, more people to college. Brian, your book, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, offers some solutions for struggling colleges and universities. Can you highlight some of your recommendations?
Sure. And first, I just want to make the point that higher education has been described as a deeply conservative industry populated by highly progressive people. And that it's probably changed less over the last century than any other industry in the country. And as John said, that's just not acceptable. And higher education does need to look in the mirror. When you have about 40% of African American students graduating within 6 or 8 years, that should not be acceptable. So what can colleges do? I think they need to rethink the way they teach. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that learning through doing is more effective than learning through listening. And yet we still have a lot of institutions that rely very heavily on lectures. Colleges can do much more to connect themselves with their local communities, with employers, with K through 12 schools. Colleges have both literal and metaphorical walls around them. And I don't think that works anymore. I think colleges need to think about looking outward and less about looking inward and rely more heavily on things like apprenticeships, internships. And colleges need to experiment with new ways of teaching, new ways of organizing themselves. They're incredibly inefficient financially. And most colleges just can't get away with operating that way any longer. The consumer can't pay for it, and the outcomes don't justify it.
The way you talk about it, Brian, it makes me think of the college as everything essentially being a community college, it being at the center of the very fabric of a community or a group. Hey, John, you reported on declining enrollment, but you've seen something interesting happen in one market specifically. We were talking about this earlier, Latino and Latina students.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So that's the only growth market. The number of white, Black, and Asian 18-year-olds is declining. The number over the next, I think it's 14 years, the number of Hispanic 18-year-olds goes up by 14%. But Hispanic enrollment overall is lower than white and Asian enrollment. And so universities have to work at recruiting more Hispanic students. That's been complicated by some of the pushback against DEI. Universities that are doing a good job at enrolling Hispanic students aren't necessarily doing anything unique to them. They're providing support services that apply to all students. But many of them tend to interpret these attacks with some level of, I would call it paranoia, that they can't get caught doing anything that might be interpreted as catering to a particular group on the basis of race, gender, or sexual orientation. So even when we wrote a story about universities and colleges that were doing a really good job at enrolling Hispanic students and thereby ensuring their continued revenue from tuition, their continued strong enrollment, their continued sort of sustainability, to use your word, they wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't discuss it with us. They were actually succeeding at something, but they were afraid to discuss it. And so that is really worrisome. That those two trends are intersecting at the same time. I think that's the impact of a lot of this chaos that's going on. The culture wars attacks on colleges and universities, the cuts to research funding, the investigations into anti-Semitism, they are coming on top of an already really significant problem that we've been discussing about demographics and enrollment and completion. And all of these things have an ultimate effect on our economy. And instead of fixing these things, we're making them worse.
I appreciate you taking us squarely to the intersection of politics and higher education. It helps us do the work to get higher ed on the wheelhouse. So thank you for doing that, John. Brian, let's talk about something else that is right in that particular arena. Recent crackdown on campus protests. Are we seeing any impact of this on the stability of colleges and universities?
Well, you're seeing a lot of changes in college and university policies in relation to protests. Colleges are calling in the police much more quickly. They're changing their guidelines. Some of it is appropriate, I think. In my own view, having students wearing masks on campus when they protest is problematic because you don't know, in fact, if it's even a student. But some of it really gets into the area of freedom of speech and academic freedom, and becomes really, really troubling. It's certainly not helping the perception of higher education. Unfortunately, I think that it's also being used for pretty obvious political reasons, even at a place like Columbia University, which has been the site of the largest protest in the country and where I got one of my degrees. There are 35,000 students at Columbia, and maybe at most there were 300 or 400 involved in the protests. And yet the perception is, the argument is among some people, that Columbia is a factory for Marxist students. And it's kind of ridiculous when the professions that graduates of places like Harvard and Columbia go into disproportionately are areas like finance and consulting. These are not young Marxists. They're very much young capitalists.
You said there, this is kind of like where we're at in society right here. As you talk about kids wearing masks on protests, and there's the safety issue, and we talked a lot about having issues, particularly in the early days of the Israel-Hamas conflict, about having people from out of school coming to campus. But then you have the very real issue of there being international students and them being worried about being taken away by the Trump administration. So it's so fascinating to see all of this take place on campus. I do have a comment, and this kind of goes through to the fact that Brian Rosenberg, who I speak to here, was the former president at Macalester College. He works at Harvard University in the graduate school there, and he has a degree from Columbia University. Here's a comment from Jackie from New Haven. I carry 2 degrees and was educated in Connecticut, master's at Quinnipiac University. I think it would be really sad if people with the desire to learn stopped at high school. And also, I spoke to a woman at Gateway Community College earlier this year. She is in her late 70s, and I think her goal is to get 1 million degrees, and she continues to learn. So tell me, folks, as we finish up, how important is an education? You guys can get the final thoughts. You start us out, Brian.
I still think that education is the key to solving most of the world's problems. Education is the one thing you can invest in that has a payoff in virtually every area in the world. Just a quick response to that 70-year-old. I think one of the things that higher education needs to start thinking about itself is not as something that you do on the way to something, but something that happens throughout one's life. Ultimately, the economic answer for a lot of these institutions is to shift to a different market.
Not traditional students. I got to cut you off there because we got to get John in for a final thought here. You got about 20 seconds here, John.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say in 20 seconds that I agree with Brian. But there's empirical data suggesting that you make more money over time with a degree than you do without one. Now, does that always justify the debt or the cost? I don't know. And it would be nice to watch everybody work together to solve that instead of fighting from the trenches.
So glad to talk to John Marcus today from the Hechinger Report, and also with Brian Rosenberg, visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They actually do a lot of work together, and it's great to hear their minds here on college. Very important if you'd like to hear the future of higher education in America. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken. Technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Thank you to Megan Fitzgerald and company for helping us out with the show. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you to Tess Terrible as well, handling the phones. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Hey, thank you so much for listening.